Hello, James Holland here. As many of you already know, I recently swapped out my US Dodge for a Bedford MW truck. It drives better, has more space in the back, and perhaps most important for my wife, it's got actual doors. But the process of insuring a car made in 1939 can be very difficult. You often aren't able to speak to someone on the phone who understands the vehicle's value and what sort of cover you need. So that's why I use Cherished Vehicle Insurance Services. They're a fantastic insurer who specialise in historic and classic cars. The team speak your language and are all specialist vehicle enthusiasts themselves. Whether it's cover for a T-34 tank or your classic VW camper van, Cherished Vehicle Insurance Services' broad knowledge base has someone on their team to support you. So next time you need to insure your pride and joy, speak to Cherished Vehicle Services.
Hello, and welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. This is part 2 of our conversation about Greece. We hope you enjoy it. James really got going. He got the bit between his teeth and has done some research on his holidays.
We've talked about this before, where a thing like ordure cyclone is like, we know about that, but it's the exception, not the rule in France. Whereas that sort of thing is happening in Greece, isn't it? On a regular.
Yeah. So what happens? What starts? So the kind of the awfulness of occupation. It is never worse than it is in the winter of 1941 to 1942, the first winter of occupation. Well, there's no resistance really. There's people sort of fleeing to the mountains and all the rest of it. But obviously, it's organic. It's early days. The reason the communists are able to kind of get hold of the EAM and then develop ELAS as a result of their political part is because obviously they've been clandestine in the 1930s. And so they're used to doing clandestine operations, which no one else sees. Yeah. So they've already been underground. So they've already got that underground infrastructure in place. So that's why they kind of sort of emerge. And what they do is they appeal very broadly to kind of a wider number of Greeks, talking about kind of, we're going to introduce the Demotic language so that more people can use it, so it's more easily understood. So we're going to improve schools, social welfare, civic projects, communications are all going to be improved. We're going to do all this. And everyone's sort of thinking, what's not to like? Sounds great. I'm part of that. And we're against, obviously, the occupiers and all the rest of it. But it then turns very, very brutal. And, as they become more powerful, there's kind of 50,000 members of EAM by the summer of 1942. Very, very few people in ELAS in early maybe 10 to 12,000 by, early 1943. That's risen to about 24,000 by the summer of 1943. Yeah. It's doubled or quadrupled by the summer of 1944. Yeah. But with that becomes, you're suddenly handing an awful lot of power to bands of people like Aris, in the mountains, and that kind of power, that authority corrupts because who do you trust? Who's betraying you? It's got to be my way or the highway. And so yes, we've got all these visions for better schools and communications and civic affairs and all the rest of it, and free assemblies and freedom of press. Yeah. But not until the war's won, and not until we're on top. And up until that point, anyone who's a traitor, in inverted commas, and that doesn't mean a collaborationist, that just means someone who's not towing my line, is liable to be tortured and executed. And it's just an absolute complete horror show. Yeah. I mean, it really is. But to understand all of this, you have to go back, and you have to go back. Very, very loosely, you have to go back to 1821, which is the start of the War of Independence. Yeah. 1829 is when the Greeks finally get away from Ottoman rule, become an independent state. It's not until I think the 1830s it becomes a monarchy. And then you've got the whole kind of the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913. Then you've got the First World War. Then you've got the War with Turkey and Smyrna and all that. And it is worth kind of going into all that. But maybe we should do that next time we do. But it's so interesting. And then there's Metaxas, of course, which is this sort of weird anomaly because he's a fascist dictator. Takes over in 1936 on 5th of August is the moment 1936 when he takes complete power.
Woodhouse and Myers stay in Greece, don't they? They're not extracted after that. They remain. Woodhouse certainly remains completely involved in SOE activities in Greece after this after Operation Harley, doesn't he? So he's involved in talking to the six colonels. He's involved in all of the internal politics.
So the six colonels. This is classic kind of SOE operating from afar. So the six colonels are total irrelevance. They're ex-army guys. They're pro-monarchist. They're basically based in Athens. They've got this tiny little movement. But in terms of kind of what's going on in wider Greece, they are like a grain of sand. I mean, they are totally irrelevant. And it is absolutely typical of SOE Cairo, who's getting its directives from London, saying these are the guys you need to focus on. Yeah. Because they're supporting King Andrew II, King George II.
And Woodhouse is told to go and make friends with them, contact them and set them up with SOE.
Right. So then they have this and they have this conference in Cairo where members of ELAS and AM and EDES and EKKA ECHA all come, plus the six colonels. They all come for this conference in Cairo. Yeah. And it is absolutely clear that those who are the SOE headquarters in Cairo, compared to those who've been on the ground, are literally totally poles apart. Yeah. So what Cairo has been thinking and what is the actual reality is just a massive chasm.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that London, via Churchill and the chiefs of staff, and then diluted down to SOE Cairo, think that because they're British and because they're kind of top dog, they can say, we're okay with that. The six colonels and this kind of royalist thing might not really be kind of what everyone's saying now, but we'll make it so.
Yeah.
And what Myers says is that ain't going to happen. Yeah. If you want to do this, you're going to have to back ELAS. But because the heart of ELAS is communist, and there is this fear of a communist takeover in Greece, that is unconscionable for SOE and indeed for Churchill and the British government back in London.
It makes France all sound quite simple. I suppose in France you've at least got the fact that there will be an invasion and that they are coming, whereas you haven't got that leverage, have you, in Greece? The British can't actually promise any direct action, can they? So French resistance, you can say there's a second front coming. Don't worry, it's inevitable. It's obvious. It's obvious that's what's going to happen. Whereas in Greece, everyone knows first of all, everyone knows it's impossible. Just too difficult, wouldn't it be? Just too difficult to pull off. And obviously a distraction from the main effort, as Bomber Harris would say. So it's fascinating when you look at the Greek monarchy, because after all, the British are thinking in terms of monarchy as best part of a 1,000-year institution, with its ups and downs and its twists and turns, and not necessarily totally stable. But you've got kings who resign. You've got two kings who die from 1833. Otto resigns, then George I dies, then Constantine I abdicates.
He's forced after the great. So there's the national schism,
exactly,
which is between Venizelos, who is the prime minister, and he is pro-allied, and he is all for getting involved in this. So now we're going back to the First World War. This is why all this is really, really, really relevant, because during the First World War, he is prime minister, and he's saying we should support the Allies, and the Allies are keen to get Greece involved for maritime possessions and for all sorts of very good reasons. Whereas Constantine, because he's basically German, is kind of is pro German anyway. And so he wants to stay neutral.
Yeah.
And so
that's the best he can do.
That's the best he can do. And Venizelos, who is this great statesman of Greece, of modern Greece, and still venerated to this day. I think the airport Athens is the Venizelos International Airport, for example.
Yeah.
So he wins out. Constantine abdicates, and Alexander, his son, takes over as king, and they do get involved. And on the back of that, they then push on and take Smyrna in northeast, in that kind of, what's it, between Turkey and Greece, and the kind of, the northern Aegean. And that goes horribly wrong, and they get it. They get that area from the Treaty of Sèvres, which is kind of one of the kind of Versailles post-war settlements. But then Ataturk takes over in Turkey, and Kemal Mustafa Ataturk.
Yeah.
He takes over, leads his counterattack. Smyrna is taken, hundreds of thousands of Greeks are killed. Smyrna is torched.
Yeah.
And then there's the Treaty of Lausanne, in which Smyrna is given back to Turkey. But at the same time, it's agreed that 1 million Orthodox Christians from Turkey are going to move back to Greece, and 500,000 Muslims from Greece are going to move into Turkey, which is this sort of unbelievably traumatic, terrible period.
Yeah.
Alexander is then kicked out and forced to abdicate. And there's then 11 and a half years without a monarchy. Everything starts to go, that's all working okay as a sort of Greek republic until the Wall Street crash, which of course has a knock-on effect to absolutely everybody and causes political upheaval. So then the king comes back, but it's George II who comes back, not Alexander.
Yeah.
And then Venizelos is involved with a military coup to oust the king again. That fails. He flees to Paris and promptly dies.
Yeah.
And so that's the end of Venizelos. But there is still the Venizelos view, which is a kind of Republican view rather than, it's anti-monarchist.
Yeah.
And then lots of prime ministers die one after another. And so King Andrew then invokes a temporary caretaker government and makes Metaxas the deputy prime minister. And Metaxas is this former general who is... very, very right-wing, absolutely slavishly monarchist. But he's only got, in the most recent election, he's got something like 7 seats out of 300 for his party. So politically, he's like a complete irrelevance.
Yeah.
But what happens is the prime minister then dies again in office, and so Metaxas takes over.
Yeah.
Even though, because no party, neither the Liberals, who are Republican, or the Royalists can form a majority government. And so the only way they can form a majority government is with the help of the Communists, who are also very, very tiny.
Yeah.
But obviously the Venizelos, the Liberals, are up for doing that. But that's completely unconscionable to the army officers.
Yeah.
Who just go, no way, Jose. And the king goes, no way, Jose. So he uses some ancient executive power from 1864 to put Metaxas in power.
Yeah.
Metaxas almost immediately just disbands the state and gets rid of parliament, gets rid of free press, turns it basically into a fascist state, just like that.
The thing that's striking about all this, Jim, though, is even had the Second World War not come along and caused these, this is what Greek politics would have been like anyway, without the Germans in the mix, is that you've got people fighting like rats in a sack. And what's interesting, following the general European pattern, there are people who've turned to fascism, there are people who've turned to communism, that these movements, because we so often think of those movements as being German and Italian, but in fact they're or Russian, they're super active and causing massive for a government to come in and do that, to act that sort of decisively and draconian in such a draconian way is interesting in itself, isn't it? Because obviously that means there must be support for that. There must be a chunk of the population who think, fine, this is exactly what we need to do.
Well, exactly.
Fascist governments don't get in without people wanting one. That's the bald and unhappy truth of that. Yeah,
exactly. I think the comparisons with someone like Trump is really, really interesting, particularly with all the rhetoric he's come out with in the last couple of days. About sort of executing drug traffickers and X, Y, and Z, and reneging on this and kind of changing that. What everyone the reason why no one lifts a finger to Metaxas when he first takes over, even though he's up to that point been this kind of fringe figure. It's because everyone's exhausted. There's been so many prime ministers, there's been so many governments, there's been so many, there's been kings and then not kings. There's so much upheaval, and everyone just sort of goes, it's quite nice to just actually have one person in charge who's just sort of, laying down the law. Quite into this for a moment.
Yeah.
But what he's doing is, and so it's the same as, it's kind of very much like Petain coming in. Metaxas is like, he's an old general, he's reliable, he's got a sort of clear vision, he's getting rid of all this sort of political upheaval, maybe that's not a bad thing. And what's really interesting is none of the kind of intellectuals are kind of swarming, Greek intellectuals are swarming to communism or to the left.
No.
Or particularly opposing Metaxas. There's no kind of outspoken people sort of going, oh, Metaxas is terrible, or anything like that. All these sort of, denying the freedom of press, increase of police and secret police and all this kind of stuff, and the clampdown of any kind of personal freedoms, in terms to kind of speak your mind. None of that is kind of, there's no one really lifts a finger about it. And that's because of the fear of communism. And what Metaxas does is the same sort of thing that Trump's doing, which is shouting very loudly about a perceived threat which actually isn't a threat. I.e. communism. But actually, communism is very, very small beer in the 1930s in Greece. It really, really is. But what he's doing is, he's pouring concrete onto a fault line.
You're driving people to it, aren't you?
You are, but what he's doing is he's pouring, there's a fault line in Greece between monarchists and anti-monarchists.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely split down the middle. It's a complete binary thing. It's kind of Brexit or Remain. It's kind of, it's Trump or not Trump. It's the same kind of thing. But by pouring concrete into that fault line, you're just covering it up. You're not getting rid of the fault line, and that fault line is going to kind of split again.
Yeah.
And of course it does in the Second World War.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about Metaxas is that what happens is when Italy tries to, the difference between the Metaxas kind of autocracy and say Nazi Germany or fascist Italy is that Metaxas has absolutely no territorial ambitions whatsoever.
Yeah.
He just wants political stability.
Yeah.
And strong central state of which he's in charge. That's his aim. There's no further aim. Whereas obviously across the way is Italy, and Metaxas reaches out to Britain repeatedly saying, can we be allies? Can we be allies? Can we be allies? And Britain saying, well, 1939, don't really, that's sort of rather.
No, that's a good idea. Yeah.
That's sort of, that's red rag to a bull, all this kind of stuff. Don't want to kind of antagonise the Italians. Don't want them going in the war. Blah blah blah. So they kind of resist all that, and then at the same time, Metaxas is having secret conversations with the Germans. Goebbels visits him, for example, in early April 1939. And Metaxas is kind of not at all reassured by Mussolini. He knows what Mussolini's up to, particularly once he then goes into Albania in April 1939. It's absolutely clear that the next step is going to be Greece.
Yeah.
And then that's exactly what happens in October 1940. Yeah, and at that point, the Grazzi is the Italian ambassador to Greece, and he calls on Metaxas in the early hours of whatever it is, 28th of October, and says, you need to cede a whole load of lands to us, or and allow us free passage of our troops anywhere in Greece, or else we're going to invade. And Metaxas repeatedly says "Ochi," which means no, and at this point the whole of Greece is completely behind him.
Yeah.
And this is where, all the generals, the Greek army is up in Epirus, which is just across the sea from where I am at the moment. And, they counterattack against first of all, they resist the Italian invasion. And then within 2 weeks, they've actually pushed back into Albania. And it's an absolute catastrophe for Italy. And of course, the next step, of course, is Germany getting involved in the invasion of the Balkans in March, and then the invasion of Greece on the 7th of April, 1941. And so, but unfortunately, Metaxas then also, it's like absolute kiss of death being a prime minister in Greece. He dies of pneumonia on the 29th of January 1941, so he's out. So just at the moment where they've achieved this, they've had their finest hour in Greece, and they've had this incredible victory against the Italians in late 1940.
Yeah,
Metaxas, their strong arm leader, dies, and there's a power shift. And George II puts in a banker as his prime minister. And it just doesn't work, and the whole state just completely collapses with the invasion of Germany.
That's the end of the first part. We'll be back in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're talking about Greece.
Given what the British know about what's going on in other countries in general, the idea that, after all, Chamberlain before the war has decided that he knows best how to deal with, he doesn't care what the Foreign Office are telling him about what's going on in Italy. He's running his own back channels to Ciano anyway. He's not listening. He's not really listening. So the idea that, and that's one of the countries he's concerned about in the Med, properly concerned about. The idea that the British would have any idea what's going on in Greece, really, an ear to the ground at all, And then for SOE to draw conclusions from what it thinks is going on. It's remarkable, really. It's sort of British arrogance, really. Oh well, we'll turn up and we'll offer them help, and we're a great power after all. And the other thing is by 1942, is Britain a great power anymore in the eyes of a Greek politician? Well, probably not, because Britain's been kicked out of France. It's been given a runaround in North Africa. It's been humiliated in Singapore. I mean, some chaps. Because after all, Woodhouse is a Tory, isn't he? He's a high Tory chap, isn't he? Turn up, don't you worry, old boy. The British will help you out in this situation. He's your absolute. He ends up a Tory peer, doesn't he, Monty Woodhouse? So you're sending you've got the wrong appraisal. You're sending the wrong people. And already, I mean, just anyone listening to this as an idea of how complicated all this is, who knows if you're going to pick the right person, and he might die of pneumonia anyway.
The interesting thing is even in 1939, the British are going, well, this Metaxas chap, he's jolly good news.
Yeah.
He's really, really good. He's a fascist. I mean, he's an out-and-out fascist. There's no, you cannot... he creates his own Hitler Youth. I mean, it's what is it called? The National Youth Organization, the EON.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. It's the same principles. As I say, free press is shut down. Parliament is dissolved. The National Assembly is dissolved. Political parties are dissolved. Police is massively increased. Secret police is massively increased. He is an absolute fascist dictator. But also he's a realist. And so listen to this. So the interesting thing about Metaxas is he kept his diary, which really is his diary. It's his absolute inner thoughts. So listen to this. Okay, this is from the 14th of July, 1940. Yeah. Okay, so Italy is now in the war.
Yeah.
France has lost. If the Germans prevail, we will become their slaves. If the British prevail, we'll become slaves to them. If neither, Europe will fall apart. It'll fall apart anyway. My God, what despair.
Wow. I mean...
And of course, he's completely right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean...
and so what... You can say, Metaxas is this appalling individual because he's a fascist, but you can also say, no, he's just a realist. He gets it that actually the only way to train, to harness Greece and these 30 years of political upheaval, the national schism, the Venizelos versus, the Republicans versus the Royalists. I mean, this is not sort of, Jeremy Corbyn and a handful of others going, I think it's time to overthrow the monarchy in Britain. This is an absolute binary, 48-52 kind of thing. In Greece, and as I say, that fault line has been papered over or filled in with concrete, but it hasn't been resolved. What Metaxas is doing, while you've got someone like Metaxas in charge, that can be kind of indefinitely maintained. But you can't once he's gone. That is the problem. Because there is no one like him to fill that gap, and there's no provision to fill that gap either. And then it is within, he dies on the 29th of January 1941. The invasion of Greece is on the 7th of April or something like that. It's all over by the, German troops are in Athens on the 27th, aren't they? It's not very long. And King George II is acting beyond kind of, he's absolutely using the extreme of his royal prevatives to make decisions which really he shouldn't be, because that's not what they're set up to do. He does have that within his armoury, but it's an exception, not the rule. And so he's wandering around like a sort of, a very, very, very right-wing kind of over-dominant monarchist. King. And there isn't really the stomach for that within Greece. And then they bug out, and of course the British are all like, you're the king, and you're a royal family, and you're kind of Northern European, and you're related to us, so of course we're going to look after you, sir. And all this kind of stuff, and it's all just a bit awful. Because he's a bit crap.
Like I said, it's complicated enough without the Second World War then intervening and stirring the pot.
Well, it is the proverbial tinderbox. That's the
and it's the Americans are not interested in Greece, right? They're not.
Well, they are. They send. There's loads and loads of OSS agents that go in as well.
Right. God.
So it gets really, really complicated. It does get really complicated.
God.
On the 18th of April, there is an emergency meeting between the king, the prime minister, who's this guy called Chrysis, who is this banker from the kind of, National Bank of Greece, who's become interim PM, at the Grand Britannia Hotel in Athens.
Yeah.
And they go, oh shit, what are we going to do? Greece is collapsing.
Yeah.
What's the plan? Well, we'll move to Crete to start off with.
Yeah.
Chrysis just goes, I'm completely out of my depth here. Please let me resign. And King George II goes, no, absolutely no way. Last thing I want is my bloody prime minister to resign. So Chrysis goes home and shoots himself. There's another prime minister that's died on the job. I mean, it's literally the kind of the poison chalice to beat all poison chalices.
That is amazing.
And so another MP, another banker takes over, Emmanuel Pseudoros, who takes over, and he evacuates with the king. And they become the government in exile, first in kind of, Crete, then in Cairo, and then in London for the rest of the war, where they're cozying up. And of course, the Greek royal family is then rubbing shoulders with, Queen Wilhelmina. Yeah. But also the British royal family, and the British elites, and Churchill, and all the rest of it.
And so keeping that going. Yeah.
But they're doing that from London with absolutely no idea what is actually going on in Greece, and and it's not just. I mean, listen. So food prices. So because the Germans come in, they take all Greek gold. Okay, just half-inch it.
Yeah.
The Greeks are dependent on imports for food anyway, but they do produce decent amounts of tobacco, decent amounts of cereals, currants, wine, and various other things, olive oil, and so on.
Yeah.
But the Germans take all that as well.
Yeah.
And there's no means of kind of producing that. There is massive inflation. So the value of a drachma plummets. So price of bread in the first year of occupation is 70 drachmas per unit.
Yeah.
But by the end of that first year, by April 1942, it's 2,350 drachmas. And by 1944, it's 2 million drachmas.
Jesus Christ.
From 70.
Yeah.
So is it any wonder that people are starving?
Yeah.
Now eventually the Red Cross do manage to get some kind of relief aid into Greece. But obviously it's not enough. The black market is absolutely rampant. I mean, lots of people are taking to the mountains. And of course, the Germans and the Italians and the Bulgarians don't really want to go into the mountains too much. So as long as
too difficult.
Okay. But what you do is what SOE are encouraging these guys to do is lots of acts of sabotage.
Yeah.
Working on the basis that, on the understanding that the Greeks think there's going to be an Allied invasion, of course, which isn't.
Yeah.
SOE and the British know perfectly well that by encouraging these acts of sabotage, there are going to be horrific reprisals.
Yeah.
Which are going to lead to lots and lots of Greek civilian death. So again, you've got this by this middle part of the war, which I think is really, really interesting. By 1943, this is my point. When I think the Allies start getting really back into Europe again, I think that is the point where the kind of the Great Crusade, the morality starts to be questioned. And it's also the time where the Beveridge report is being circulated and all the rest of it. It's also the time of the Bengal famine, etc., etc. So there's all these moments where you're bombing large scale. It's the start of the all-out strategic air offensive against Germany. So suddenly you've got these, one can argue the toss either way, but you are getting these points where there are, questionable morality to that crusade.
Yeah.
And I would say the active encouragement of resistance against the occupiers in Greece and indeed in the Balkans, for example, in Yugoslavia, are two examples where the Allies know perfectly well what that means. And in the interest of deception plans for Sicily, for example, we talked about Operation Animals, which is also led by Eddie Myers in May, June 1943, before the Sicily invasion. We talked about that before. All those series of operations against viaducts and bridges and all sorts of stuff. All those, some 44, I think it was, little operations within the wider Operation Animals. By encouraging that, which is a deception plan for Sicily, which is of spurious significance, I mean, we've already had that whole discussion about mincemeat. I mean, it doesn't make any difference at all. But as a result of that, lots and lots of Greeks are being killed. And I don't know how I feel about it quite, but there is a sort of morality to it. There's question marks here.
But also, isn't there a cynicism in it? Is that
yes, there is.
Of a slightly different order. That reprisals will, after all, bind people to the resistance. They won't put people off resisting the Germans. They'll encourage them against the Germans. And so if you do things that cause reprisals, it's as likely to shore up popular support for your side as it is to damage it. You've obviously got some people going, can we please stop doing this because of the reprisals? You've got other people who won't be able to see that far and just thinking, well, the Germans are bastards. I want them out, and that's also part of the calculation. It's because we, right at the start of this, we talked about how do you mobilise people to fight? How do you get people? How do you, and I'm not saying it's like a false flag kind of consideration, but it's this idea that if the Germans are being bitterly, or the Italians or whoever, because after all it's the Italians in 42 doing reprisals for Operation Harley. If that's going on, it's a good way of saying, look who the bad guys are. We just want our country back, and look at the way they're. Do you know what I mean? That has to also be part of the calculation, because if it wasn't, it's all a bit naive, isn't it? It's all a bit. I'm
not saying that the British were wrong. I'm just saying it's one of the reasons why the Second World War is still so incredibly fascinating, because we're drawn to it because of the human drama, and yet just in this little. I mean, whoever knew about Greece, for example? I mean, it's completely forgotten. No one cares about it. These little activities are going on. We haven't even. I mean. Between 1941 and 1943, 250,000 people died of starvation in Greece. Starvation. That is 5% of the population. And then on top of that, you've got 48,974 Jews from northern Greece were taken straight to Auschwitz. Of those nearly 49,000, 37,386 were gassed on arrival at Birkenau. Okay, and that is. About 90% of Greece's Jews were killed in the Holocaust, which makes them, as a proportion of the Jewish population of a country killed, it's about the highest. Yeah, it's even higher than Poland. Yeah, it's even higher than Hungary as a proportion of the country's Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. I mean, it is an absolute horror story, and for the vast majority of Greeks, whether you're particularly tough in urban areas, of course, because that's where the food crisis is greatest. But what's your choice? You either kind of sweat it out in Athens or Piraeus or Patras or wherever it might be, or you try and you flee to the mountains or whatever. But once you're in the mountains, you're absolutely it's a. Either which way you go, it's a kind of, it's what is the lesser of two evils, but they're both really awful, because it means that every single day is just a struggle to exist and survive. You have families split up and separated. When you've got these Andates ruling around and they're run by someone like Aris, who is notorious for his extreme cruelty and lack of pathos. The smallest thing, and you're tortured, executed, have your nuts chopped off. All the rest of it. And as I say, it turns into this civil war. I mean, we just don't have time on this episode to talk about the kind of denouement of it, but maybe we should talk about that next week. But I mean, it is absolutely astonishing and sort of eye-opening how complex this is, and just what a nightmare it was for people in Greece, and how tough it was. And I think, when you see the anger at the kind of, the German loans and all the rest of it, you say, in recent times, it all goes back to this, and you sort of you can't help but feeling a little bit more sympathetic to the kind of tentacles of
so the source of the animus, basically.
It's how the Germans look at it, they're not in the slightest bit interested in occupying Greece, apart from the kind of the key bits. So they occupy Athens and Piraeus and Crete, anything that's sort of particular interest to them, and the rest of it they leave to the Italians. Oh, and also the Dodecanese, so close to Turkey and all the rest of it. So Rhodes, Simi, Liros, so they're occupied by the Germans, but. For the most part, they're occupied by the Italians. And, you know, the Captain Corelli view of sort of, you know, rather charming kind of mandolin-playing Italian commanders on Kefalonia is just completely mistaken, because the Italians are just as brutal as the Germans in dealing with the Greeks.
Yeah.
You know, the Germans maybe execute 20,000 Greeks during in their bits of the occupation, whereas the Italians, it's more like 80,000. You know, those are big numbers, aren't they? I mean, imagine the whole of kind of Wembley completely packed.
Yeah,
and all of those have been executed. Each one of those represents someone that's been executed by, or the Yankee Stadium or something.
Yeah,
or Stade de France. You know, every single one of those represents someone that's been a Greek person that has been executed by Italians. I mean, it's not great, is it?
No. Anyway, that's all we have time for. We've lots of stuff.
More than we've got time for.
More than we've got time for. Lots of stuff coming for the festival for Thursdays. I think we've got the best German generals, I think, which is a hard thing to, after all, define, because what you want is German generals that lose. But we will see you all soon. Thanks very much for listening. Cheerio.
Cheerio.